Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. It is February 28th, so technically the last day of February, so welcome to this month's briefing. There's a lot to get into today. We obviously are dealing with a lot of the same problems we've been dealing with for the last 2 years from the perspective of our Marin County economy. And as usual, we're going to be joined by our chief economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, who's going to take us through some of the most recent data and give us an idea of how the Marin County economy is faring as we look forward to this year of hopefully easing of restrictions on businesses and consumers and getting our economy back to where we were sort of pre-pandemic. You can learn about our organization, the Marin Economic Forum, by visiting our website at www.marineconomicforum.org. There you can find all kinds of studies that we've been working on recently, as well as recordings of these presentations and others. You can also make sure that you and your colleagues can subscribe to our newsletter, make sure that you get invited to events like these. So with that, I'm going to jump right into it here. There's a lot going on, and Rob Eiler is going to take us through all of that, and then I'll come back as usual at the end and with a few comments of my own. So with that, welcome, Rob. Why don't you tell us what's going on out there?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, folks, for coming today. Let's get right into it. One of the things that we saw in February was an update of the Federal Reserve's interviews of 40 forecasters that come through the Philadelphia Federal Reserve branch, and they look at a bunch of different economic variables. But I'm going to move us through to the annual forecasts in terms of those changes, starting with real GDP or income after inflation. The columns above that, or the data above that in the first panel, are the quarterly forecasts basically through the end of this year. And you'll notice in the case of real GDP, there was an initial downgrade and then it catches up with unemployment. We seem to have a speeding up of our labor markets across the board over this year. And then inflation looks like it's going to subside. But what I want to do is take us through the rest of the first half of this decade in terms of what the latest and greatest forecasts look like. So if you look at that bottom shaded area, that's 22, 23, 24, and 25, the column that's not shaded to its left is last quarter's forecast. And you can see for 2022, there was a slight downgrade from 3.9% growth in 2022 to 3.7. A lot of that because we did not see the fiscal package really come to fruition that we expected as additional to the budget for the fiscal year 21-22. We still don't have a budget at the federal level for 21-22, which makes it even more tricky. So the supposition is there's going to be a slowdown. And I'll come back how Eastern Europe and what's going on there might actually lead to a further slowdown in just a minute. But then growth kicks back up again in 23. And then through 24 and 25, we're basically back to pre-pandemic sort of stable growth, a little bit above 2% after inflation, but not rising up very quickly anymore, but not also slipping into recession. So the key there is that we don't see recession before 2025, with a couple of caveats I'll come back to in a minute. On the labor market side, unemployment at the national level is probably going to move around what we think of as sort of classically full employment conditions. With wages rising and an inability to find workers quickly, that's sort of definitional full employment conditions. We will see how that holds. We will see, for example, if we see an increase in the number of people in the labor force rising, with the idea that there were people that had exited the labor force and are now looking to come back in, especially if wages continue to rise up. That might slow down the movement of unemployment going down for a little while and actually pick it back up. But that's picking back up for the right reasons. We're attracting more people who weren't working or declaring themselves available for work previously. So that's a good thing. Anything around 4% or under 4 is good in terms of employing the labor force that's out there. The inflation is the big question. I'm going to break a little bit more of this down in a second. But for now, economists are still pretty convinced that we are going to see a turn of inflation in 2022 from what happened in 2021. But in just a second, I'll break down why we think that's true and some of the costs that are going to come with that suppression of inflation growth. But for the most part, there's two things to get out of that shaded area. One, we've seen an upgrade, even just from the last quarter, in terms of the inflation that's going to still linger in 2022. And the second piece is that at 2.2% per year looking forward, that's still higher than we were pre-pandemic, as we'll see in just a second. And that's worrying economists that we're going to have this sort of lingering movement of inflation that's at a higher level and in a sense undermining real growth into the middle of this decade. Not too much, but a little bit more than we saw in the last decade. So with that in mind, inflation remains, other than what's been going on geopolitically, one of the big questions of the global economy, much less the US economy. What these data are the monthly movements of what we call the core personal consumption expenditures prices, or the largest measured basket of goods and services that households buy. So since these data are monthly from 2007 forward, you'll see the two shaded areas, one large, one skinny, moving left to right. The large being the Great Recession, the skinny one being the COVID-19 recession from a timing standpoint. But the key is notice how much of that data lived underneath that dotted line. That dotted line is the Federal Reserve's goal, if you will, that it's not a mandate, but it's a goal of monetary policy to keep inflation somewhat wobbling around that dotted line. It might pick up a little bit, so you pick up interest rates or do a little bit of quantitative tightening. That takes us back down a little bit, and you sort of weave around that as best you can. And to a certain extent, the last decade was typified by relatively stable and low inflation and helped us recover from the Great Recession. In the latest recession, one of the penalties for having relatively strong equity markets, housing markets, and quick recovery from the recession was this pickup of demand, which for better or for worse was parallel to a contraction of supply as we were slowly globally coming out of the restrictions from COVID-19. So the combination of those two forces is the classic genesis of inflation pressure in a macroeconomy. And we believe, which is the shaded area here, that we're starting to peak in terms of the growth of those prices. Now, this is a forecast that was out there from beginning of January. The data have not yet been updated in terms of how the latest for the January data added to this will help reshape this forecast. But those red dots are basically where we're supposed to be going over the next few years. Notice that the red dot on the far right-hand side still lives above that dotted line. So like I said before, we might have some lingering inflation pressure regardless of what we do. But what we're watching closely is, are prices starting to stabilize or fall? Now, with Eastern Europe and what's been going on there, we should expect some lingering inflation pressure because we'll likely see energy prices remain elevated for the short to medium term. And we should expect that there's going to be some reticence because of a potential global recession that might come if things escalate for the Federal Reserve to get too aggressive. So we're watching very closely how the latest, just the last couple of weeks of changes might change how the Federal Reserve looks at rates. And we're going to come back to that in just a second. Our wages are going to continue to rise. The labor market woes will transmit themselves through supply chains and start to, or continue to put pressure on prices. And how much higher will housing prices go? And all of these are kind of tied to each other. As inflation starts to rise, you get a little bit more pressure on interest rates, regardless of what central bank policy does. And so we'll see how housing prices in those forecasts start to reshape themselves if inflation lingers on too much longer, and that starts to transmit itself into longer term interest rates and ultimately into mortgage rates changing and going up and staying there. The biggest thing from a policy standpoint is trying to decompose the supply from the demand side. Federal Reserve policy or any central bank struggles with doing anything if supply chain conditions are problematic. It's really going to reshape demand. So we're going to be testing those waters here, probably starting in a couple of weeks when the Federal Reserve makes its first interest rate move up. Well, I'm going to show you these data as a way of thinking about where the Federal Reserve may be going. Interest rates will be probably one of the biggest topics moving forward for the rest of the year, given we know there's going to be at least some uptick in American interest rates. Well, in September 2021, what these dots are the opinions, at least sort of in a straw poll way, of what we call the Federal Open Market Committee. And that is the interest rate and sort of monetary policy body for the United States inside of the Federal Reserve. Those dots represent where they think interest rates were going to be in 2022 on the short run or in the short term market based on Federal Reserve policy. So you can see that while 2021 was flat as a pancake, basically no change, and that's exactly what happened. The opinion of this group was that we were going to start to see interest rates lift up, and perhaps as high as about 75 basis points or 0.75%. Right now, we're between 0 and 0.25. So there would be sort of, let's say, somewhere between 2 and 3 interest rate increases this year. This was in September 2021. And the trajectory is following that black arrow toward, let's say, the end of 2024, where it would be the slow, steady lift of rates. Well, by December 2021, the opinions had changed and everything had moved up. And there's been a lot of rhetoric about what's going to happen with Federal Reserve policy. So that the box and the arrow is where we were in September 2021. You can see in December it had lifted off completely, even though the long run, that sort of final on the far right-hand side look at interest rates had not changed that much. The supposition was going to see a little bit more aggression. However, let's think about this for a minute. Why would you see, let's say, 3 or 4 interest rate increases? And a lot of that's because we believe we're trying to get more aggressively back up to where we were pre-pandemic, perhaps even before the 3 rate cuts that took place in 2019, simply to stabilize the demand side and stabilize inflation. If we see 5 or 7 interest rate increases or their equivalent, depending on how they roll out, the supposition is that inflation is lingering higher than we want. Demand is driving that inflation, and we need to be more aggressive. If we see 1 to 2, it means that there maybe is more supply side issues, and demand still needs to have some fuel inside of it to keep us going. But if we think about what's happening in Eastern Europe and how that then translates to the things I've just said, is 1, the lingering conditions of uncertainty and conflict in Eastern Europe means we're going to have heightened uncertainty, more volatility in financial markets. We're going to have more pressure in energy prices to continue to stay relatively elevated. And if we move into, let's say, to April or May, and there's still conflict engaged, bets are going to start going sideways in terms of where we were going from a global growth standpoint, even just from 3 months ago. And you may start to hear predictions of a slowdown in global growth, maybe tipping over in some countries back toward recession. But we will see how the next couple of months go. But those are the things to be thinking about. And there's going to be more pressure on rates to rise in the long market the longer and longer this goes, because it just increases that global uncertainty. And bond markets are going to be looking for higher yields as a result of having higher risk. Okay, so that's the national context. Still looking good. The last couple of weeks have been really crazy, and hopefully it's not going to get any crazier. We will see. But as of the end of January, in terms of the data we have, and then thinking about what we've seen thus far in February, the labor market in Marin County is still showing pretty good recovery. The last couple of months of 2021 slipped a little bit, and some of that was because of the restrictions with Omicron. But we should see in January and February's numbers, which are going to come out in March, kind of almost back to back, that black line tipping back up toward the red dotted line. The blue line is the evolution of the Great Recession in Marin County, where both of these are indexed because there's different sizes of the total volume of workers that were working that live in Marin County. So the blue bowl shows you how long the Great Recession lingered. This is one of the reasons why we call it the Great Recession. The black line shows you how sharp the cut was in the number of people working and how quick the recovery initially was, where now we're sort of slowly migrating up toward where we started, and that's the red dotted line. So we need that black line to go above that red dotted line as soon as possible. We're on that path. The last few months have been a little bit of a slowdown based on social restrictions and generally certain problems in trying to find workers. Comparatively speaking, Marin County classically, just like it has in the last 3 or 4 recessions in a row, has recovered more quickly than the state on average. But there's a couple of caveats here. If we just look at the unemployment rate alone, which has some flaws in terms of how it's measured, it's, for example, the movement in the labor force, which you can see for Marin County, is still about 3% down from where we were right before the recession began, versus the state of California, which is down just a little bit under 2%. There's lingering changes in the labor force, which means that while we have a lower unemployment rate, if folks that have left the labor force would have been counted as unemployment had they not left the labor force, the unemployment rate would be elevated. So this is one of the issues for economists in looking just at the unemployment rate, is because the dynamics of the folks that we count as part of the unemployed, if they've left the labor force, that will undervalue the actual number of people that are sitting out there as unemployed, because we're not catching them in the data. But for the state of California, we're still about 5% unemployment at the end of December. Like I said, we're going to see the January and February data come out in a couple of weeks, and then a couple of weeks after that. So in March, we're going to see both those months told to us for the state and county level. And it'll be intriguing to see how Omicron had lingered into January's data, and perhaps how February saw a little bit more of a breakout. But these data are okay, not great in terms of California. California is still one of the most elevated unemployment rate and still under the civilian employment level with respect to pre-pandemic conditions of all the states in the United States. One of the biggest questions looking forward in terms of business is how we're going to utilize commercial real estate. So Newmark provides a forecast every quarter and also a statement about what happened in the previous quarter. These are from the fourth quarter of 2021. And you can see that inventory is basically flat for Marin County, and this is for Marin County office space only, as kind of a microcosm of regional office space. Vacancy rates have stabilized, though they're elevated. And the forecast looks like vacancy is going to slip down a little bit. The supposition is that we're going to see people come back to the office. Absorptions is forecasted to go up, but prices and construction are basically flat looking forward into 2021. So that makes the forecast for 2022 look okay, not amazing. But the key there is not only is industrial space still remaining very strong, which is sort of thinking about where we're going to see gains in commercial real estate. So much of what's going to happen in regional commercial real estate depends on whether or not we go back to the office or not. And if you think about this, folks, the one thing to watch for is looking at the core urban areas in the Bay Area. Are we seeing people en masse going back to the office? And if we do, that's actually going to support a resurrection of lost jobs in those urban areas that, in a sense, support those workers intraday in sort of secondary and tertiary ways, inclusive maybe of more business travel. So 2022 is going to be a really wild year in terms of watching what happens in our core urban areas as a way of thinking about how smaller suburban and even to a certain extent larger suburban areas where people may have moved or be working from home that were used to be commuters are now maybe going to feed into a commercial real estate market, specifically office, in those outlying areas rather than the core urban areas. So you're going to watch for that. That's where things are going to get very intriguing in terms of how larger cities look at policy around jobs and what they can or cannot really do. A couple forecasts came out from Marin County and for California in the last month or so. Caltrans does what it calls its socioeconomic forecast to think about traffic and housing conditions throughout the state. This is the latest evolution of population in Marin County and California, again, indexed because there's different sizes. And this goes from the year 2000 to 2050. So a couple of things, if you look at Marin County, there was this growth up until about 2017, and it's been slowly slipping in terms of population ever since, and is looking to decline, and maybe by 2050 be about 10% down from where it was at the peak in 2019, or I'm sorry, not the peak, but at the level of 2019, where California is looking to continue to grow, even though last year you can see that little wobble in the green line that suggests that California's population slipped a little bit. A lot of forecasters are out there saying California's population is going to continue to grow again, especially as we start to lift restrictions. But because we're having this aging population wave coming through our society, that is also going to top out sometime. And they're expecting 2035 or so to be the time in which we see a decline in the California population, not because of outmigration, but because we've had fewer kids and we're getting older. And you can see that's the forecast for right now. That gray shaded area is where we're going from here, according to Caltrans's demographers and economists. From a job standpoint, this is their forecast for the evolution of non-farm workers. So you can see that from 2000 forward, these are annualized data, just like the last one, the last slide. You can see how both California and Marin kind of walked the same path, saw the same decline as a result of the recession, and have been climbing up ever since. The shaded area is the forecast. So for Marin County, we see growth of jobs. For California, we see slightly elevated growth of jobs looking forward to 2050. However, demography is a lot easier to look forward than is employment. So even though we think, okay, well, if you can see forward in terms of the population, shouldn't you be able to see forward in jobs? Yes, but because of economic forces and conditions changing, where demography is a much more long-term science in terms of being able to forecast it further, the growth rates being this much different or just generally growing at these paces, we have to think after about 5 years, it gets a little bit more foggy. However, the supposition is at least through the end of the first half of this decade, we should see jobs growth in both the county of Marin and California remaining in a growth cycle, basically still in recovery. Now, from that, here's an employment forecast for Marin County through 2030. So if you take 2019, the pre-pandemic benchmark, the end of 2019 is the beginning of this next phase, this is where growth is looked at from Caltrans's standpoint, from that brand new forecast that just came out, where leisure and hospitality, transportation, professional services, and health and education are kind of the big growth areas. And health and education, it's really more in health than education in terms of inside the data. Look down at the bottom, finance is the one where we're likely to see more consolidation, fewer jobs, and really kind of a slow contraction throughout Marin County. And that already started. But I wanted to show this against what happened the previous time frame, coming from the end, like the beginning of the Great Recession to the end of that growth cycle in the last decade. And this is what happened. Why I wanted to show you this is because the growth of manufacturing really in Marin County around life sciences took off in the last decade. I mean, that's an amazing growth phase where that's now seen as slowing down over the next 10 years based on really just having such amazing growth over the previous 11. So when you look at this, the thing is for Marin County, and Mike and Marin Economic Forum have been working on this economic vitality plan here. Where are we going from an industrial standpoint is critical to matching or exceeding those jobs forecasts, but really thinking about providing a vital economy with breadth and depth in terms of what jobs are available and ultimately the types of businesses that inhabit Marin County's economy. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Mike. Thank you again for coming today, but these are the things to watch for in terms of where we might see growth in Marin County's economy, at least in some third party's latest and greatest forecast.
Thank you so much. That was just a ton of information. My head is spinning with the number of questions that you raised through the data that was presented. And so I'd like to use the balance of our time to provide some follow-up questions to you. But first, let's start with this slide that we're all looking at right now, because as Rob mentioned, we are right in the throes of the Marin County Economic Vitality Strategic Plan, which is both an analytic and sort of in-person qualitative exercise. And we did run some analytics regarding what we call a competitiveness assessment. That is taking a look at the Marin County economy benchmarked against other regional economies, trying to understand where our comparative advantage is. And one of the things we find when we start to look at the labor force is the growth projections that are here are a little bit problematic from a couple of perspectives. One is you see the largest growth estimated to be in the categories of jobs where there are lower relative wages. And so it's not that job growth is a bad thing, but if it comes at the expense of other higher wage jobs like financial activities or in the IT sector, then that poses a big question in terms of what kind of jobs we're going to have available for our residents. So some of this is just organically will happen as more entrepreneurs open up different types of businesses or other businesses try to grow. But the fact that the largest growth projections are in occupations that have the lower relative wages is somewhat problematic from our perspective, which puts more attention on where is the growth in the higher wage opportunities, as Rob points out here, healthcare, education, life sciences. Those are others that are starting to emerge as very important sectors for Marin County to have some type of purposeful focus on. So I just want to make that point before I come back to Rob with some questions. So let's look at the national picture, Rob, which of course is just very, very complex, whether you're looking at the return to office issue, the inflation issue. Over the weekend, there was an article that discussed how despite inflation, consumption continues to increase and continue at a pace that's higher even than pre-COVID levels. For example, right now, as anybody who's trying to buy a new car knows, prices are not only increased, but according to a website, Edmunds.com, which is an auto data site, 82% of new car buyers are paying over the sticker price. We've never seen anything like this before. So I guess the question comes back to you, Rob, is the Fed is taking some action. When will we have an idea of whether inflation is being tamed, and how will that be measured? How will we know that?
Yeah, great question, Mike. So I think we're going to know it sort of in two major ways. Is one, it'll be somewhat visible, right? People, or lay people, I should say, tend to look at what's going on with gas prices at the pump because they drive by a bunch of places that have posted prices. Now, it's dangerous to use gas prices as a true bellwether of what's going on with inflation, but people's expectations and actions can easily be swayed by a 10-cent jump in those prices. So one of the things we're watching for is to see if we do actually see a flattening effect, or like let's say a couple of months where there's not really much change in fuel prices and people are maybe getting used to the elevated levels, and then they start to think, well, okay, maybe inflation is starting to slow down a little bit. So part one will be to see if energy prices sort of transmitted to people generally through gas prices flatten out. What's going on in Eastern Europe and in general going into the driving season suggests it will not anytime soon. But the key is it not zooming back up or continuing to grow toward, let's say, $5.50 a gallon, depending on where you live in Marin County or around the Bay Area. The second thing will be housing prices and car prices also starting to flatten. In the initial stages of the jump in inflation we saw in the graph before, housing prices and auto prices rising were the dominant force in that initial upswing. And then when those prices started to flatten out a little bit in terms of growth, other prices started to kick in because we saw general supply chain seizures, especially as we moved toward the holiday season. So if housing prices and car prices are being talked about as starting to flatten out a little bit, that'll be the other quote unquote visual we'll be getting. But if none of that stuff happens, then we're going to see some lingering effects going into next year, probably. Once the Federal Reserve starts to increase interest rates, however, we should see some of the reactions among that set of visuals to help us out.
Okay, very good. I don't think that watching housing prices in a market like Marin is going to ever be a good indicator to look at. So we'll have to keep an eye on the national picture for that specific indicator. If you don't mind, if you could, Rob, if you could go take your slide back to the labor force participation rates between California and Marin, because this is something that is a little bit of concern to us. There you go. Whoop.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep.
Right there. You know, as your graph shows, there is an upward trajectory of job recovery, but it's really not moving that quick. You know, for legitimate reasons, you cited Omicron as the latest sort of stumbling block. But you know, one of the things that we're concerned with is there's a very real possibility because of demographics, especially with our county being older, a lot of people near or at retirement age, that we're looking at more of a permanent reduction in our labor force. We're already seeing potential population declines. Again, a similar question. When are we going to know that the workforce, our labor force, has simply been diminished, and we need to find other measures? Employers are going to have to find other measures to fill those jobs, as if they're not already taking a lot of measures right now. When will we know if we've got a sort of a permanent reduction in our labor force?
It's a great question. So from a data standpoint, we probably will not know until the census data comes out for 2021, much less for 2020, because the 2020 data will give us, in a sense, a benchmark of these were the shifts that happened during the initial stages of the pandemic. Then 2021, the supposition is you're going to have a lot more permanence in terms of the movement of people, at least in this sort of short run phase in the shadow effect of the pandemic and the subsequent recession. So it might be another 18 months before we have a really good feel of who left, the types of households that changed in Marin County, and what that leaves us with in terms of an aging populace, the types of jobs that are populated by those local residents, and then ultimately what kind of a workforce do we have in the wake of that, and how much more dependent are we going to be on an imported workforce? So it'll probably be 2023 late before we know some of the answers in the data, but you're going to hear more and more from employers that they're struggling to find workers that live in Marin. They might even be struggling to find workers that live regionally, and that's going to give you more of a real-time feel about what changes have truly happened and the availability of workers, especially in personal services types of jobs where the wage is still relatively low regionally.
Yeah, and this, of course, was an issue pre-pandemic. It continues to be a major issue within our economy with no easy solution. So thanks so much, Rob, for all of this data. I'm going to wrap it up now by sharing a link in the chat to a program that MEF hosts annually called Forecasting the Future. We're going to be doing it live and in person this year on March 30th. And we're very excited by it. Dr. Eiler is going to be presenting a much more robust forecast for the rest of this year. And situation is so fluid now that in 30 days from now, we're going to have lots of different talking points to share. We'll also be using that opportunity as a platform to share early findings in the Marin County Economic Vitality Strategic Plan and sort of where that plan is going. So it's going to be a great opportunity to hear firsthand from us and our partners on that project to see really what's going to be in this strategy as we prepare it to finalize it and hopefully have the County of Marin adopt it. So once again, I want to thank everybody for attending. There's just so much information out there. Hopefully we haven't delivered it too fast or too furious, but we do want to be a resource to you. So continue to check our website. There will be another briefing next month. We look forward to continually engaging and informing and watching the recovery of our economy. So once again, thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next month and enjoy that nice sunny day out there. Take care.